So what we're going to do is look at how a quick recap of the business model canvas first, but looking at it slightly differently from what we've seen before, right? To make it more amenable to looking at the innovation aspects, right? And then we look at two examples, Skype and Nespresso. These are again chosen actually quite deliberately. They're actually both quite old examples. There are many companies now who have innovated, disrupted business models in many different industries, which we've seen actually in the last few years, right? And these are all big companies already. But there is a reason why we've selected examples that are a bit old, and I'll come to that in the latter sort of part of today's session, right? And then we look at after having this basic sort of understanding of innovation and how that applies to the business model canvas and what you've seen so far, how do you actually do that for your own business model, right? I mean, that's the part that is critical, and your assignment for the next week is actually going to be around that, right? So that kind of nicely segues into that. Okay, so let's get started. Let's look at the innovation matrix, right? So if we actually look at the different companies out there, the different business models out there, and group them based on because we're looking at innovation, how whether there is a completely new technology, so whether the newness of the technology is low or high, and then what is the impact on the actual market or industry? Is it a small sort of gradual incremental impact, or is it a substantial, completely industry changing kind of impact, right? So if we build this kind of a matrix, you get a 2x2, and which is actually quite self-descriptive. Obviously, those innovations that are incremental in nature, so where the impact is actually not that high, it's quite low, and you're not really using any new completely new technology, so those are the kind of improvements that you might see in traditional businesses, a continuous improvement, or you have the whole sort of total quality management, Kanban. There are many small initiatives that companies undertake to make incremental changes, how to actually increase quality or to increase yield, how to do the same thing better, right? And maybe using some tools that are available to you, right? And for our discussion, obviously, in business model innovation, this part is not really it's not really relevant, right? So we'll not focus on that. We'll look at the other three, right? And out of those other three, there are two that are actually more interesting, which we'll look at in more detail, right? So let's look at those innovations where the technology actually is no new technology is deployed, but the impact on the market can be quite high. So this can be you see in traditional businesses where they're trying to go into a newer market or a newer product category, right? So it could be expansion into other countries or other markets. You're selling exactly the same thing in a different market, or it could be an extension of your product, right, in the same market by either modification or extension. So what you're basically doing is you are increasing the value of the market that you are targeting or creating, right? So again, you might not be, the innovation aspect from a technology point of view is typically not high, but the impact can still be very high, right? I mean, a company, let's say, that is so far operating only in their own home country, right? And let's say they have figured out a way to modify their product and to distribute it. Now an example could be, using the internet or digital distribution channels to sell it overseas through partners, let's say. So that allows them to expand significantly the market that they are targeting, and that can potentially multiply the size of their business, right? So the impact is very high, but in terms of innovation on the product or the technology itself is actually they're basically working around the margin, right? It's only marginal. It's not like a complete sort of redesign or complete redoing or creating something new from scratch, right? But the impact is very high, and therefore it needs to be looked at very seriously, right? For all the companies that are in this cohort, and for any startup, particularly, those innovations that are technology driven are actually a lot more relevant, a lot more critical, right? To understand what kind of business models are used to disrupt their industries. And it is not just about having a new technology or a new product. It is also innovation on the business model itself, and that's what we look at, right? So there are completely new technologies out there, right? And many of the companies in the cohort who are in the room today actually are in these sectors, right? I mean, there is robotics, there is artificial intelligence, energy storage, there is blockchain. So there are already like four teams in this who are actually actively in these, who are leveraging these new technologies, and while as they build their companies, right? So the nature of, because the technology is completely new, the uncertainty is very high, right? So the change is fairly dramatic. So it is not a gradual change that happens over time. It is very sudden, right? And it is not just about the unmet or unaddressed needs of your target customer segments, but maybe needs that are not even known today, that don't even exist today. But the new technology makes it possible, right, to meet those needs even before they are actually discovered. So these are the revolutionary technologies that help create these markets. And obviously the ultimate form is where completely new markets get created, right? Because there is a new technology that's driving that change. Things that were basically not even possible, couldn't even imagine in the past, but new technology has driven it. And I was actually watching a video, and maybe I'll share. Guy Kawasaki gave this TED talk on innovation. I'm going to share that for next week's assignment for everyone to hear and watch, in which he basically talks about this is obviously, the example is from the US, but he talks about ice. Ice has been a business, right, in the US, and how that's changed over 100 years, right? And 100 years ago, making ice was an industry, right? And the earliest form was, what they actually used to do was, in the colder states in the US, in winter, where lakes were frozen over, people actually used to go to these lakes, and they used to employ cutting tools and saws, and they used to actually cut the ice from the lakes, and then they used to cut it into blocks, and then they used to go and sell this ice door to door, right? I mean, that was the earliest form. Obviously, they innovated over a few decades. So they started using sharper tools, more efficient ways of actually cutting the ice and maybe even delivering it to make it cheaper for the customer, and it became more and more ubiquitous, right? Use of ice, and I'm talking about 100 years ago, right? I mean, this is not recent. And over a period of time, people got used to actually having ice at home. Before that, it wasn't available. Then the next level of innovation was when the big companies actually saw that it was, and then technology actually developed, cooling technology developed, where it made it possible to take water as a raw material and in a factory actually convert water into ice. And then large factories were put up, and they started making ice in factories, and then that was sold as a product, retailed as a product, and you can still, it is still done today, right, to this day. And so that became the next wave or next cycle of innovation. And the interesting thing was that the companies and the people who were involved in this business in the first cycle were not there in the second cycle at all, right? Because it was a completely new change that came from outside the industry. And then that scaled for a certain time. That they created more and more efficient ways of making this ice, cheaper and cheaper, distributing it and all of that, right? So all that happened. And the next wave actually came from making ice at home. I mean, now we have fridges at home and ice can be frozen, and it was unthinkable 40, 50 years ago. But now, I mean, it's every home has a fridge almost, right? I mean, so and again, the companies that make fridges are actually are completely different, right? They're not the companies that made ice, they're in factories. So the reason why this is a very good example is, for innovation, is that innovation in itself is not something that is new, right? As a process, it has been done over 100 years, maybe more. It is how those principles are actually applied to different businesses, and what triggers, what tools are used to actually create disruption in different businesses and industry sectors. That's actually critical, right? So and you see this happening with not just startups but in traditional companies as well, right? So watch this video from Guy Kawasaki. In the next week I'll share the link. It's very interesting. He gives this example and he talks about 10 principles of innovation, which anyway is quite topical for our this week's assignment. So in terms of so let's move on. So this is a slightly different view of the business model canvas that we looked at, right? So reducing it actually to the 4 main dimensions, right, which answer these 4 questions. So obviously one big part is around the value proposition. So what are you actually offering to your customer? Who is your customer? That's another dimension. So what's that customer segment? And then how is this value proposition actually created? So the whole value chain, the delivery, the resources, the left side basically of your of the business model canvas. And then how is revenue created, which is your bottom side, right? So different revenue models, how do you charge, pricing, so on and so forth. So the reduction to these 4 elements, right, of your business model. Now, innovating around these 4 dimensions of the business model is what is critical, right? So when you actually innovate 2 or more of these dimensions, that's when you actually get you actually have, you have innovation in your business model, right? So when you're doing something novel, so it could be around customer segments that you're targeting, or you're maybe creating a whole new customer segment which didn't exist earlier, or it could be the way that you're delivering that value to that customer segment. Maybe the value proposition itself that is being innovated upon, or it could be a revenue model that is new, right? I mean, with technology companies, you have all these different business models. So licensing is now actually older, but now with software businesses, software as a service kind of businesses, you have freemium, you have pay as you go. So there are many different revenue models as well. So any of these dimensions can be taken up, and you can actually do innovation of these. There are so based on research that has been done, there are actually 55 different business models or different ways of innovating around these four dimensions of your business model canvas, right? And we'll look at a couple of examples of how this has been done, right? So the first one is Skype, where again, let's go back to these four dimensions. Who was the target? For Skype, it was the mass market, right? The old and these are and then we'll talk about how the innovation actually happened. But the old version basically was looking at the mass market. The value proposition earlier was calls, international calls, especially quite expensive. Companies that operated in the telecom industry typically charged for the phone call. Also, if you were making international phone calls, then there was a very complicated system of actually charging. Depending on the country that you're calling, and the arrangement that the telecom provider had with the telecom provider in the other country, in the receiving country, the charges were basically decided, and they were, in early days, as we might remember, they were exorbitant, right? International calls. In terms of how these calls were delivered, I mean, typically these big telecom companies had this huge telecom infrastructure, right? I mean, telephone exchanges, actual physical sort of hard wires, that connected different telephone exchanges, and then a way to transfer calls, which the basically non-digital way in the earlier times. So what did Skype actually do? Skype actually innovated around different aspects of the business model. So what they did was they figured out that they were as the number of internet users increased globally, they realized that there were a lot of people who were basically on the internet, and they could they wanted actually to, or they could become potential customers for making phone calls over the internet, right? So they developed this technology, or they leveraged this technology, voice over IP, and presented this value proposition to the mass web internet users, right? Free internet and video calling, which was a great sort of way to capture those users who wanted to make calls on the internet. Also, what happened was, in addition to that, there were people who were actually on the web, but they wanted to call people who are using traditional sort of telecom, mobile phones and landlines and so on. So there was an opportunity to actually create another product to combine the two technologies, the old school sort of telecom and voice over IP. So that became the other value proposition. So using these two, and obviously then they created different channels like Skype.com, and their app, their mobile app, etc., became the way to actually deliver that functionality to their users. They had lots of partnerships with headset manufacturers and others. And obviously their key activities, now coming to the left side of the BMC, the main thing really was building the applications and the software for enabling this video, internet-based video calling, right? So that was the key activity, and obviously resources were basically the developers and the software that was developed. And then once and then they had to build this whole partnership network with payment providers, telco partners, as well as distribution partners to enable the whole BMC to actually work. Revenue streams were around primarily around subscriptions, which people paid for making calls to phones, because internet to internet was free, and that was the hook that got people in. And then there were hardware sales as well, because earlier they used to offer these devices that allowed you to call a physical phone, or call from a phone to the internet, to an internet based member. And then there were, obviously, costs were largely around developing the software and applications, and then customer service related costs, right? I mean, managing complaints, billing, customer success, all of that, right? That was the innovation that they brought, which kind of over time, I would say, to a very large extent, disrupted the whole telecom business in a way, right? So, so, so basically, they innovated around actually all these four dimensions, right? So they actually targeted. So when you look at who they were targeting, what customer segments, they actually targeted a completely new customer segment. So web and smartphone users. So fairly recently developed, because of the increase of the penetration of the internet over time. A segment that the telecom companies did not pay a lot of attention to in the early days. So they innovated around that. They also had a unique value proposition for these users, where free video calls were actually offered. And for those who wanted to call traditional phones, they were offered at low rates the ability to call these traditional phones as well. As far as the how aspect is concerned, of of the value that was delivered, traditional telecom companies had huge investments in infrastructure. Like I said, I mean, the telecom exchanges and all, and which was already sunk cost, right? So Skype obviously didn't have to make any of those investments, because they were using a completely different model of delivering the same value to, or actually a new enhanced value, right, to a new customer. So their way of delivering obviously was by creating world-class software applications to actually deliver this video calling ability. Also, in terms of the revenue model, there was a innovation as well. Traditional telecom companies actually, if you remember, had a pretty flat pricing. So when you applied for a phone and you got a phone number, there was a per call. There was a fixed charge, and then there was a per call charge that was charged to everyone, right? There might be with some differences in use based on usage, but largely everyone was charged. Whereas Skype users, 90% of the user base actually are free users who call internet to internet, but 10% of their user base actually needs this functionality to call phones, and they are the ones who actually pay, right? So it's a freemium kind of revenue model. So there was a innovation in the revenue model as well, right? So what this did is it completely disrupted this sector. As you know, Skype, Microsoft actually acquired Skype. I mean, I haven't seen revenue figures, etc., published, because Microsoft doesn't actually break them out like that. But based on at least anecdotally what we know, I mean, the annual revenues for Skype would be in the billions of dollars annually, right? I mean, the last 4 or 5 years ago, I heard a speech by someone in Microsoft who talked about the revenue reaching already 2-3 billion. This was 5 years ago. So I expect the revenues now from Skype to be anywhere between 5 and 10 billion. And then if you look at revenue multiples, you can imagine what the valuation of that business would be today, right? I mean, it would probably be close to 100 billion, right? Given the size of Microsoft, obviously it's quite tiny, but that's the value that really got created by this innovation, which completely disrupted this industry. So again, a great example of how each and every each dimension, each of these 4 dimensions were actually disrupted by using technology, right, and business model innovation. So the next, before I move on to the next one, I'll quickly sort of pause, in case there were any questions. Okay, I guess not. So let me move on. We'll take questions maybe at the end. Another good example of innovation of the business using the business model is actually Nespresso, right? So again, ubiquitous today. I mean, almost everyone, well, at least almost everyone I know has an espresso machine either at home or in their office, right? And so it might seem, so today it seems almost natural, but before this business was launched 20 years ago, the coffee business, in the old way that it was run, what was it about, right? So typically the companies in this business, they sold coffee in retail chains or supermarkets or whatever it is. Now the problem with coffee is that it's a commodity, right? And therefore the margins that companies make actually are not that high, typical of commodity businesses. So companies always had this problem of, and obviously the smarter, more profitable companies built brands that allowed them to get higher margins by increasing prices and so on. But there was a limitation to what they could do, right, in terms of gross margins that they could own, even with a strong brand. Now, also there were other in the same market. Maybe there was no consumer targeted coffee machine at that time, right? I mean, typically when you either you boiled, you had these small stovetop machines on which you used the coffee powder, you boiled and you made coffee at home, or you had coffee in a restaurant or a cafe, right? There was no other way to actually make coffee, right? So how this value was delivered, I mean, it was retail shops, supermarkets, cafes, things like that, right? And in terms of the market segment, this was basically for everyone, right? The mass market. And the revenue model, again, the old style, like I said, was the margin, the gross margin or the retail margin that the company made on the coffee powder that they were selling. So bigger companies or companies that have developed very strong brands over a long period of time had higher margins, but those that didn't have strong brands suffered, right? So they struggled to actually make money. And when I say commodity margins at a net, at a PAT level can be 5% or lower, right, for commodities type businesses. So when Nestle kind of started kind of thinking about the whole Nespresso business, this is what they were actually dealing with, right? I mean, issues of the existing industry, the way it constrained how profitable they could actually be. So what they did was, so what I'm going to do here is, hang on. So what they did was, again, they took each of these elements and they innovated each of these elements of their business model. And they needed a few iterations before they got it right, but ultimately they got it right. So what I'm going to do is play like a 3-minute video, which is from Alex Osterwalder, who has designed the business model canvas that we are all familiar with by now. And he actually talks about how Nestle put together and improved the business model canvas for Nespresso. So let's take a quick look.
My name is Alex Osterwalder. I'm the lead author of Business Model Generation and co-founder of Strategizer.com. I'm going to walk you through the business model of Nespresso, a company that sells coffee in the espresso business. So let's look at the value proposition first. It's composed of 2 products, the Nespresso machine, and the pods that go with it. And we're going to look at the distribution strategy that Nespresso has. They sell the machine to retail to households, which means they earn a one-time transactional sale from selling the machine. Most of that money goes to the key partners, the machine manufacturers, who they work together with. Then for the Nespresso pods, they have a totally different distribution strategy. They only sell the pods through their own channels. Started out with mail order and call center, then they built Nespresso.com, and today in the biggest cities of the world, you'll find Nespresso stores as well. This is interesting because it meant that they had to build distribution channels as a key resource in their business model, because this is the first time that a Nestle-owned company sells directly to households. Now, why do they use different distribution channels for the machines and the pods? Well, they use retail because it has the broadest reach possible, because they want to get the machine into your household. Once you have it in your house, you're actually locked in because you can only use Nespresso pods. That's so-called switching costs, which prevent you from going to another machine manufacturer. And they defend that through the patents that they have in the key resources. And some of those patents actually expired last year, which means they need to renew their business model to a certain extent. Now, once you have the machine and you're locked in, you're going to have to buy pods from Nespresso, which means they earn money from repetitive pod sales. They create so-called recurring revenues. They change an entire industry from moving it from a transactional business to a repetitive business with recurring revenues. So interestingly here, they have recurring revenues, they have direct sales with higher margins, and they ask you for 5 to 6 times more for the coffee that you pay. So they get people around the world to pay much more money for the same amount of coffee. Now let's look at the left-hand side of the business model canvas to see what they need to have to do what they plan to do on the right-hand side. First of all, they need coffee. So they work together with coffee growers, and they try to source some of the best coffee in the world, which they put in the pods. And the pods is something that they manufacture themselves. So production of the pods is an important key activity, and they have production facilities to do that. They churn out 12 billion pods every year, which is one of their main costs. Another important activity and key resource and main cost is marketing and branding. Obviously, when you're in consumer goods, you need to put a lot of money into that. And the last piece here that's interesting is that because they sell directly to households, a decision made on the right-hand side of the canvas, they had to build up business-to-consumer distribution logistics, which we find on the left-hand side of the canvas. So now we have everything that's important for the success of Nespresso on one piece of paper. And interestingly, when Nespresso started out, they had a totally different business model around exactly the same product, and that almost went bankrupt. So it's only after a couple of iterations of the business model that they were able to find the business model that you see on this piece of paper and that led to a multi-billion-dollar business. So the difference was not the product alone. The difference were all the pieces here on the business model canvas that led to the success of Nespresso.
So, as we've seen, so they spent quite some time innovating.
My name is Alex Ost.
Sorry about that. Innovating again, all 4 dimensions of their business model, right? So the value proposition itself changed from just selling coffee powder to actually coffee capsules, very good quality coffee that was sourced, and put into this capsule, and the machines to produce high-end quality espresso at home or in an office, right? The target customer, I mean, it was no longer just the mass market, but people who like to drink good coffee, right? At home, in offices, and so on. How was it actually delivered? Typically direct selling approach, right? I mean, if you see, there are Nespresso shops, the branding and the amount of money that's spent on packaging, branding, design of the machine itself, design of, what the package actually looks like. That's where a lot of the investment actually went. And the revenue model is basically selling the coffee machine at a very low cost. In fact, and then actually really making money on the capsules. In fact, the latest sort of, and this is slightly dated. This is when they actually launched, and the first few iterations that they did of their business model. Now, the latest, what we have seen, and again, in the past couple of years, what we have seen is that they are actually giving away the coffee machines for free, right? So you have all these different packages where you sign up for, let's say, a year's supply. So you promise to spend $50 or $100 a month on coffee capsules, let's say for a year, and you get the machine free, and you get to keep the machine after a year, and you can stop your subscription after a year. So, so you're basically getting, and the coffee, as far as the price is concerned, the price per cup of coffee for the individual is still 1/4 of what they might pay at a fancy coffee shop, like at Starbucks or somewhere else, right? So, so they have had to continuously sort of iterate and is there a comment? Okay, so they've had to continuously iterate and change the business model. In fact, one of the problems now that they are facing, and over the years that they've faced, is the coffee capsules are actually made of aluminum, and there's a big recycling component to this. As we all know, aluminum is environmentally not friendly. It's not biodegradable, and the newer, younger customers are extremely sensitive to these aspects, right? And being environmentally friendly, being a good corporate citizen, all of these things. So, so Nespresso actually has kind of fallen behind a bit in innovating that part, right? Because there are other companies who have kind of seen this trend sooner than Nespresso did. And they actually, if you look at patents that have been filed for biodegradable, capsules, it is not Nestle that has the patent, it is other companies. So other companies kind of spotted this opportunity and they've actually gone ahead. There are now also, you can get capsules that are made of steel, which can be reused. So you actually fill the capsule with coffee powder, and then you can use any coffee. You don't have to buy the coffee from Nespresso. Coffee capsules from Nespresso only, right? There are many other companies, coffee making companies, that offer coffee in capsules that are compatible with Nespresso machines. So there are, as you see, there are many different patterns and many different ways of actually innovating, even beyond what we've seen with Nespresso. So, so those were the two examples, right? But now, what does it mean for you and your business, right? So let's come to that part, which is incredibly important, right? So, like I said earlier, based on research that has been done, there are 55 different ways of innovating your business model, right? And we won't obviously talk about all those 55. But what I'll do is I will share a document that very nicely articulates these 55 different ways for your reference. And then it is up to you to kind of see what's the most applicable. In fact, some of you are already using, some of these business models, some of these ways of innovating your business models, right? So there will be some familiar ones in this document, but use this as you look at ways to innovate in your business model. Now, if you think about again application and how to actually innovate your business model. So what Nespresso and Skype, the two examples that we saw, I mean, those are not the only two examples, right? I mean, we've Apple has done it with iTunes. Hewlett Packard did it with printers. The printer, the cost, the price at which they sold the printer has been always quite low, but they really make the money on the toner cartridges and the any consumables that actually go into the printer, right? Amazon Kindle, same thing. I mean, it's priced at a fairly low price point, but they really make money on every book that you buy, that you read on the Kindle, right? I mean, that's where they make most of the money. So, so we've seen in the last 20-30 years many companies adopting this business model and innovating and creating a lot of value, right? So Nespresso is not the only one. Many companies have done this. And what is even more interesting is if you think about and the reason why, and now I'll go back to reason why we chose Skype and Nespresso as the two examples. Those, even though these are a bit older than many companies who continue to kind of use this kind of a business model even today. The reason why we chose these two examples was to basically communicate that innovation itself as a process is not new, right? If anyone were to guess who did it first and when, this kind of a business model, right, where you actually charge for the consumable, you make money on the consumable. Another example is Tetra Pak, right? I mean, the material in which we have beverages that are available in the supermarkets, right? So Swedish company Tetra Pak that makes these big machines, which are pretty much given away for free, packaging machines. But what they make money on is actually the material, which is patented, and there's lots of novelty around that, right? So, but if you think about who did it first and when was it done the first time, any guesses? Gillette has been doing it for more than 100 years, right? By making money on that little blade, and that's where all the innovation has been, and they've created all kinds of blades, battery operated, so all kinds of blades, and the razor itself, the holder of the blade, I mean, that is the more expensive component to produce, but that is actually given at a low price. They've been doing it for more than 100 years. And what we saw these companies, and I mentioned a few others, all these companies have done is that they have adapted what Gillette did so many years ago, right? So the innovation comes in how these models are actually applied to your business, and so it's not rocket science. It's not something that you're something completely new that needs to be built that no one understands. I mean, the mechanics, the economics of these models are actually well understood. There are enough successful companies who've done that in the past. It's all about translating those learnings and applying them to your business. That is actually important, right? So how to actually innovate your business model? I mean, 4 steps really. Over the past 7-8 weeks, we've looked at you closely kind of looked at your business model canvas, sometimes designed it, redesigned it. Go back to your business model again. Use the innovation lens. Look at confront the business model with the 55 different innovation patterns that I'll share that document that are available that other companies have done, and then try to see what you can innovate. Which of those 4 dimensions of the business model can you actually innovate on? If you can innovate on 2, 3, or 4 of those dimensions, the more dimensions you innovate on, obviously, the more the better it is for your business, right? Because the more disruptive then your business is. So identify how you can actually innovate. Then once you identify how, make sure, do an integration check that all the different parts of the business model actually work well together, because they all have to, it's like a Swiss watch, right? I mean, they all have to, all the moving parts have to work well together. And once that consistency check is done, then go ahead and actually implement the innovative business model and keep iterating till you get it right. Because most likely the first time this is launched, you might not get it right, but learn from the experience, learn from feedback that you get from the marketplace. And that is how you actually build a business model that is really disruptive, and which will be a source of competitive advantage for your business and a lot of value for you and your investors. So that's all really I had. I'm gonna stop here and open for questions from everyone.